Can't stop this peeling. Honestly, I'm really not enjoying this peeling experience. Hey, welcome back to Hardly Tech. Today we're taking a look at the XFX Merc 319 Radeon 6750 XT. This will be my first review of an AMD GPU on this channel, so I'm curious to see what kind of performance we can get out of this. Let's take a look at the box. As you can see, this box is comically large. RDNA 2, DirectX 12, Fidelity FX, which AMD's FSR 2.0 just released, although there's only one game that supports it at the time of this video. Which brings me to another point. I think I'm going to pass on using ray tracing until FSR 2.0 is more widely adopted. With that said, let's continue. DDR6 memory, video streaming up to 8K. Ooh. DisplayPort, HDMI 2.1 VRR, that's always a nice to have. PCI Express 4.0, software. 7 nanometers, I mean, what do you want? Video streaming, they got it. VR ready, they got it. Image sharpening, they got it. Alright, enough of that, let's get this box open. Roll that chest music. Dun, 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 dun. Got a warranty card with warranty information. Stop! Important driver information. Doesn't come with a driver disc, but that's alright. I've got the AMD drivers downloaded. I like that they took the packaging seriously here. Nice and fancy. Alright, preliminary look. Looks pretty nice. Whoa! That radiator is dense. Frick yeah. Nice pull tabs. Makes this easy. And look at that. I like that. There's no extra plastic that I have to get rid of. What you see is what you get. Alright. So I've still got the plastic peel on here for now. I'll take that off in just a moment. But look at this. Dense fin stack. Mounted right up against the MOSFETs and the RAM chipset. 2 PCI Express 8 pins. Very nice. Look at that. Look at those heat pipes. Freaking sexy. 3 fans. 3 100mm, 90mm, 319. Get it? Got it? Good. Looking at the bottom side, we got a cable for our fans. I like that it's just the one. That makes it so much easier. I won't be taking this apart anytime soon, but if I do, that's going to come in handy. Make the process nice and simple. So for connectivity, we've got, looks like 3 display ports and 1 HDMI. I was hoping for 2 and 2. It'd just make VR easier, but this'll work. Now, another issue that I've heard about is RX 6700 XTs not having a full trace on their PCI Express lanes, causing people to only be able to run PCI Express 8 instead of 16. So let's take a look. Alright, so hopefully this will run at full 16 speed instead of 8. We'll find out shortly. Backplate, nice and solid aluminum, not plastic. Very good. We have really good pass-through right here for heat to escape. Got some openings on the back here too. Don't know how much that will help, but any ventilation is good ventilation, right? Take a look at the other side here. Kind of glad that we're taking a look because I see that there is some heat sinking on the back plate around the chipset. Very nice. I like that. Cooling looks very good on this GPU. I don't think these fans are going to be super loud. And we've got 3. It might be a little bit overkill. Better cooling means quieter operation, means longer stability. That's good in my book. Let's get our peel on. Can't stop this peeling. Honestly, I'm really not enjoying this peeling experience, and they're disconnected in the middle, so it's actually making this kind of challenging. From an aesthetic standpoint, I really like this design. It's kind of understated, it's simple, clean lines all the way around. Good directed airflow. These edges here are slightly tapered, so I feel like this is going to be really good thermally. And this is the first AMD GPU that I've owned since this, the 7950 XT, an old GPU. So for comparison, size-wise, to my 3080 Ti, this is actually longer. It's not quite as heavy, and it's not quite as thick, but I think overall the radiator is going to do just fine. So I'm really excited to see what this is capable of, especially with my AMD CPU. I don't think it'll make much of a difference, but it's neat. Interfunctionality, I like it. So I'm really excited. Let's get this installed and get the testing started. Just enough space for my CPU tubing to run past the GPU and not interfere with the way that it's mounted. Very nice. Now, normally I would use these 180-degree PCI Express adapters to run the PCI Express cables directly behind the GPU and out of the way, but the set that I have don't mount the way that these PCI Express connectors are set. So maybe in a future video I'll get a set that matches this and I can show it once again with even cleaner cable management, but I think this looks pretty good. You can get these over at moddiy.com. You can get them at a couple other places, but I got mine at Mod DIY. I highly recommend these if you want to clean up the cable management in your case. I've been using mine for about a year and a half now with no problems with power delivery. So I got a lot of questions on my airflow in my 3060 review, so I'll cover that here real quick. I've got 3 Lianli AL120 fans as intake on the bottom underneath the GPU, pushing air up. I've got 3 AL120s on the top, pulling air out. And I've got my CPU with the fans on the backside, pushing air through into the case. As for the GPU management itself, I'm going to use MSI Afterburner, and I'm going to use the same fan profile that I use for all of my other GPUs. I'm going to have fans set at 40% fan speed at 30 Celsius with a linear ramp up to 70 Celsius at 100% fan speed. I hope that answers some of your questions about how I run cooling on my GPUs. I try to keep it consistent across testing. That way, it's a one-to-one, apples-to-apples comparison based on how all of these GPUs manage themselves. I find that for the most part, this helps keep my temps down and helps keep the noise levels at a manageable level. Nobody likes having their PC sound like a jet engine taking off when they try to play a game, right? So that's how I run it. Let's see how performance is with this setup. We're starting today's testing with some games that feature ray tracing, but ray tracing will be kept off. Starting with Doom Eternal, Far Cry 6, Forza Horizon 5, which only kind of features ray tracing, and Resident Evil Village. Next, we'll head into our standard Rasterized games with Days Gone, Dirt Rally 2, Halo Infinite, and Red Dead Redemption 2. And finally, our esports/casual section with Counter-Strike Go, Diablo 2 Resurrected, Fall Guys Ultimate Knockout, and Plants vs. Zombies Battle for Neighborville. Here in Doom Eternal, we're playing with settings at maximum, except ray tracing is turned off. Here in Doom, we're generally seeing frame rates between 210 and 240 frames per second at 1080p, which is pretty dang good. Temps are hovering right between 50 to 53 Celsius, which I would call really nice. At 1440p, frame rates are about 180 to 210 FPS, not a huge hit, and temps are right around 53 to 54 Celsius. At 4K, we see the biggest dips. Frame rates are generally hovering between about 80 and 100 FPS, once in a while reaching up to about 110 to 120, but that's not really the norm in action. Temps are again very good, right around 55 to 57 Celsius. We can also see that at 4K, we're actually utilizing more than 8 GB of VRAM, so I'm kind of glad this one has 12. Rule number 2 of Sanctuary Island: we don't talk about the crocodile. In Far Cry 6, we're playing with settings maxed out once again, except we have ray tracing settings turned off. In the Advanced tab, we have VSync and Fidelity FX turned off as well. In Far Cry, we can see that at 1080p, we're generally maintaining about 80 to 110 FPS on average. Temps are also very steady, right around 48 Celsius. At 1440p, frame rates are about 85 to 95 FPS on average, so not a huge dip once again. And temps are steady at about 50 to 53 Celsius. 4K sees our biggest dips in frame rate, just like Doom Eternal, with frame rates between about 45 and 55 FPS on average, and temps are still very good at about 54 to 55 Celsius. Power scaling across resolutions is very good. Power is only at about 160 watts at 1080p and up to 220-ish at 2160p. Wait. You want me to jump this car out of an airplane and drive it to a race? In Forza Horizon 5, we're playing with all settings at their maximum, except FXAA is turned off and MSAA is set to 2. Forza Horizon 5 performance is very good at 1080p, generally between 105 and 130 FPS. Temps are very steady at about 50 to 52 Celsius. At 1440p, we're seeing about 75 to 95 FPS on average, which is pretty darn good. Temps are once again about 52 to 53 Celsius. At 4K, we're seeing frame rates at about 48 FPS on the low range, all the way up to 60 FPS in some cases. Although, I think you'd have to turn a couple settings down to maintain a steady 60 FPS at 4K, but not bad. And temps are very steady at about 55 Celsius. And this is another example of a game that utilizes more than 8 GB of VRAM when allowed. Wait, so let me get this straight. I bring you food, and you give me magical upgrades? So, I made a bit of a mistake when recording Resident Evil Village. I forgot to turn off ray tracing. But SSAO isn't on, so here's a sneak peek at ray tracing performance in RE8. Frame rates are about 85 to 100 FPS on average. Temps are a little bit higher at about 56 to 58 Celsius at 1080p. At 1440p we're seeing about 65 to 80 FPS, which is still pretty dang good. Temps are essentially the same, with basically the same power draw, no surprise there. And at 4K we're looking at about 45 to 55 FPS on average. Tweak a couple of settings and you can definitely have a 60 FPS experience at 4K with ray tracing on. With the caveat, of course, that SSAO is off, though I will do a video comparing performance with these settings on versus off. And ray tracing is definitely using more VRAM at about 10 to 11 gigabytes. Hey, did any of you rippers ever watch Freakers and Geekers? Asking for a friend. In Days Gone, we're once again playing with all settings maxed out across all resolutions. It's almost like there's a pattern here. Days Gone at 1080p, we're seeing about 120 to 140 FPS on average, which is pretty darn good. Across the board, we're seeing about 220 to 230 watts of power usage, and temps are pretty consistent at every resolution at about 54 to 57 Celsius. 1440p, we're looking at about 85 to 95 FPS, sometimes up at 100, and at 4K we're seeing about 45 to 58 FPS. I think if we drop shading down one notch, we'd easily have a 4K 60 experience across the board. One odd behavior though, at 1440p, we're seeing less VRAM usage. I'm not really sure what's causing this, but I did run this test multiple times and it came up the same every time. Go figure. This baby right here, she packs in 485 weasel power. I'm playing with my optimized settings where I have crowds, mirrors, motion blur, chromatic aberration, lens flares, all set to off, MSAA at 2, and everything else maximum. Dirt Rally 2.0 is one of my favorite racing games, so it's important to me to get good frame rates and consistent frame rates. At 1080p we're seeing about 130 to 140 FPS. At 1440p we're looking at about 100 to 120 FPS, which is pretty good. And at 4K we're looking at about 65 to 80 frames per second depending on load. I specifically chose this level because I can turn rain on in an evening setting, which really pushes cards to their limit. And while I do admit I'm using my optimized settings, it really helps performance across all GPUs in this game. Temps are also very good at 1080p, ranging from about 51 to 53 Celsius to about 54 to 57 Celsius at 4K. Everyone always asks what Master Chief is doing, but nobody ever asks how Master Chief's doing. In Halo Infinite, we're playing with all settings set to their maximum, async compute on, and sharpening turned off. At 1080p in Halo, we're looking at about 85 to 95 FPS during heavy combat, with temps solidly at about 47 to 48 Celsius. At 1440p, we're looking at about 75 to 85 FPS, and about 50 to 53 Celsius under load. 4K once again pushes this card down in performance, right around 42 to about 50 frames per second under load, and temps are right around 54 to 56 Celsius at that 220 watt load level. Halo is another modern title that at 4K, and sometimes even at 1080p and 1440p, will utilize more than 8 GB of VRAM if your card supports it. There. Who's a good horsey horse? Good horsey horse. Red Dead Redemption 2's settings list is quite long, so I'll just let you look this one over. I chose this section in Red Dead Redemption 2 because this section of the city tends to push performance a little extra on these GPUs, and at 1080p we're seeing about 80 to 90 FPS on average during combat in the middle of the city. At 1440p we're looking at about 60 to 75 FPS, and at 4K we're once again down into the 40s, sometimes up into the 50s under less load. By now you've probably noticed that there's a consistent power load level across resolutions at about 180 to 190 watts at 1080p, up to 220 to 230 at 4K. And because of this, temps at 1080p are once again right around 50 to 52 Celsius, and all the way up to about 54 to 56 Celsius at 4K. Alright everybody, I've got all the bomb sites memorized this time. I'm ready to go. Has anybody seen my flashbang? CSGO is super easy to run, so we have all settings set to their maximum and MSAA set to 8. 1080p in CSGO actually leaves us a bit CPU bound, and so performance is roughly 340 to 360 frames per second, which is still really good, but there's room left on the GPU. At 1440p, we're seeing about 70 to 90% utilization, which is much nicer. And so frame rates are around 280 to 360 FPS, still very good. And at 4K, we're roughly 240 FPS and above across the board, and once again, we're seeing that temperature scaling with power consumption at about 100 to 130 watts at 1080p, so temps are about 42 to 45 Celsius, all the way up to about 55 to 57 Celsius at 4K. I'm all set for demon hunting today. Won't catch me off guard. Wait, where are my pants? Here in Diablo 2 Resurrected, we're once again using every setting set to its maximum. The only thing I don't turn on is perspective mode, because I personally don't really like it. Performance in Diablo 2 is quite good. At 1080p we're looking at about 150 to 160 FPS, and we're running about 200 watts, so temps are hovering right around 52 Celsius. At 1440p we're looking at a solid 120 FPS experience, which is great. And we're looking at about 220 watt power consumption, which leaves us at about 55 Celsius. And at 4K we're hovering right around 70 FPS. Power consumption is pegged at 230 watts, the maximum this card allows at stock, and we're looking at about 57 to 58 Celsius under maximum power draw. In all three scenarios, we can also see that the GPU is utilizing more than 8 GB of VRAM. So once again, very glad we have that extra 4 GB. I'm a bean, dabba die, I'm a bean, dabba die, I'm a bean, dabba die, I'm a bean. In Fall Guys, we're playing with all settings set to their maximum, and we have our FPS rate limit set to 300 because that's as high as the game will allow. Fall Guys has a maximum frame rate limit of 300 FPS, and at 1080p, we're pretty much there about 90% of the time. At the beginning of a stage, when everybody's getting ready to play, frame rates are about 250 to 260 FPS with all the characters and all the shading going on. At 1440p, we're running about 200 FPS near the beginning of a stage to about 240 to 250 FPS around the middle to the end when things thin out. At 4K, we're looking at 100 to 120 FPS depending on how many characters are on screen. And as far as temps, well, they're very good. 1080p is about 50 to 52 Celsius, up to about 57 to 58 at 1440 and 4K. Hey, someone told me there'd be tacos over here. Oh my god, is that a zombie? Is that a talking orange? And lastly, we have Plants vs. Zombies Battle for Neighborville. We're once again playing with all settings set to their maximum. This game isn't too hard to run. At 1080p in PvZ, we're looking at about 190 to 220 FPS, depending on what's going on in a scene, with about 50 to 53 Celsius under load. At 1440p, we're looking at about 140 to 165-ish FPS, depending on how heavy the scene is, and temps are right around 55 Celsius and pretty stable. At 4K, we're looking at about 70 to 85 FPS, which is really good. I'm actually pretty impressed with that. And our temps are again about 55 to 57 Celsius under maximum load. Well, now that testing is done, let's talk about the results. So, I'm pretty impressed with the rasterized performance of this card, and ray tracing performance in Resident Evil 8 was actually pretty good. I'm a little bit surprised with that. However, in Doom Eternal, we took a huge performance hit. I didn't show this in testing, but on my own, I would not use ray tracing with this card. The extra bump in performance that we get from the faster GDDR6 just doesn't help enough to make up that difference between the AMD cards and the NVIDIA cards. Now, a notable feature for this GPU that wasn't present on the 3060 or the 3080 Ti is a 0 RPM mode. So if you're somebody that likes having a silent system if you're not playing a game, it's already built in, so I think you'd be happy with that. Using AMD Adrenaline Software, the fan is set to kick up to about 10 to 15% under load until you reach about 65 Celsius. At about 65 Celsius, the fan will kick up to about 25% fan speed, which is almost inaudible. It's so quiet, and performance is very good. You don't really see performance dips as far as clock speeds, so as far as that's concerned, I'm really impressed with the functionality in AMD Adrenaline Software. It's nearly as robust as any other program I've used for overclocking and setting temperature limits, etc., kind of like MSI Afterburner. AMD's GPUs also feature Smart Access Memory, or SAM, if you also run an AMD CPU. When I first started testing this card, I didn't have it enabled, and I definitely noticed. I didn't really lose any performance so much as the card was drawing its full 230 watts at 1080p, even in games that only require about 160 to 180 watts or so. The GPU was having to make those extra draw calls to the CPU to transfer information from GDDR to DDR memory on the system. Once I enabled 4G decoding and resizable bar in my BIOS, everything was set up automatically through software, and the card ran like you would expect with SAM enabled. And trust me, those power savings really came in handy as far as keeping temperatures down. Now comes the part of the video that I really don't want to talk about, because now I have to talk negatively about an AMD GPU, and I've been so excited to try one out. My first complaint is a consequence of the fans that XFX are using on this GPU. The fans at low fan speed are very, very quiet. They're fantastic, you can barely hear them. But once you get above 50% fan speed, whoo boy, cover your ears. Seriously, it's loud. And at 100% fan speed, it's by far the loudest GPU I have ever owned. That being said, for the most part, my fans never went above about 65% fan speed under load. Once in a while 70%, and while it was still loud, it wasn't any louder than the 3080 Ti or the 3060 Ti that I'd used previously. Considering how big and how effective the cooler is on this GPU, most of the time you could probably lock your fan speed to about 40 to 50% and have great temps, probably a little bit closer to 60 Celsius in a comparable case with comparable airflow, and you'd barely even notice that the GPU was running. Now the second main complaint, and major complaint that I have with this GPU, editing. Now, I'm not going to say that editing is impossible with this GPU. It is definitely possible, but I use Cyberlink's Power Director, and my experience with this GPU, even with OpenCL acceleration turned on, was just not good. It was honestly worse than using my RTX 3060. In fact, it was bad enough that I had to put the 3060 back in my system to edit this video. I don't use any Adobe software, so I can't speak to how effective it is in Adobe. I've heard that it's a little better, but not enough for me to really want to say, jump ship, go AMD all the way. No, definitely not. If you are editing videos on the regular, like me and a lot of other tubers, stick with NVIDIA for now. It really pains me to say that too, because I had high hopes for this GPU, and it does so well in rasterized performance. What can I say? AMD, I'm sorry, but you really need to get yourselves in gear. You are losing market share to NVIDIA because of your lack of editing prowess with your GPUs. I could easily forgive the disadvantage in ray trace games if editing was at least on par with NVIDIA, but it's just not. Now, as far as video capture is concerned, the quality is great. All of the footage captured in this video was captured on the 6750 XT, and I can choose whether or not I want H.264 or H.265 encoding, which is fantastic. And the performance hit on this GPU was actually less than the performance hit I get on NVIDIA GPUs across the board. So to have all of that going for these GPUs and to just not be able to execute in editing, oh, it's so frustrating. I know this video is getting long, but there's one other thing I feel I need to mention. When AMD's Adrenaline Software sees that you have resizable bar and 4G decoding enabled, and it enables smart access memory on the GPU through the software by default changes your overclock to what AMD thinks the overclock should be on your CPU. I didn't notice this until my second day of recording, and I had to re-record all of the games that I had already finished because AMD's software changed my CPU overclock. What the heck, AMD? It should be an option and turned off by default. It should not default to being on. I had to reset my CPU overclock. What is wrong with you? So if you're new to AMD GPU and CPU combination setups, be aware. Thank you all for watching and sticking it through on this one. I had a lot of extra information to get through, but I do appreciate it. If you like this video, if you found the information any useful, hit those buttons. Subscribe! Check me out over on Twitter at hardly_tech. And if you want to help support the channel directly, consider becoming a patron. I don't expect donations, but any donations definitely help the channel. Because as I've mentioned previously, none of the hardware or software in my videos are sponsored. Everything is self-funded, so helping me beat that algorithm definitely helps, and I really appreciate it. Thank you all again for watching. I hope to see you on the next video. Bye!